The weather is so good this morning. We've got a really beautiful sky coming in the background here, and this mountainscape is just going to light up like fireworks on the 4th of July. Let's do this. This series is about exploring new techniques and gaining knowledge from some of the top professionals in both the photo and video field. From motion control work to editing, color grading, and lighting, this series will cover it all. Our first subject is creating beautiful cinematic time-lapse photography, something I've done once or twice before. I'm Geraci, and I've been shooting time-lapse professionally for over a decade, and I've gotten to work with clients like Steven Spielberg, David Fincher, and Alejandro Inarritu, just to name a few. Time-lapse is used in film, TV, commercials, and of course social media for a wide variety of uses. In today's reframe, I'll be showing you not only how to capture a cinematic time-lapse, but I'll also show you how to plan, compose, and process your final shots using a simple mirrorless camera and your laptop. Before you even start shooting, the first thing you want to do is you want to go out and scout your locations. Location scouting is really important because it allows you to go out there and see what you're going to shoot beforehand. There's a lot of different elements that can really ruin your time lapse. People, cars, wildlife, all those things come into a factor. Other things when you're out scouting is you want to make sure the location that you're scouting is open. Just on this trip alone, we've gone to a couple different locations, and due to snow or just due to the weather, locations have been closed. When we're out scouting, we also want to look for the composition. There's a lot of little elements out here. So if you look down here, we've got all these little foreground elements, and you would think they make really nice time lapses, but here's what's going to happen if the wind pushes up. These are just going to vibrate, and it doesn't really look very professional. So look for like wide open spaces. You want to be able to create those layers naturally in the camera, and then you also want to have foreground objects to give you depth as well. When it comes to time-lapse elements, the more of them you have, the better. In this instance though, we're just going to focus on clouds, shadows, and light, but you can practically time-lapse anything so as long as it moves. Clouds make for great time-lapse elements because they're abundant and relatively easy to capture without having to wait hours to get something special. Once you've found that perfect location that gives you the elements you need to create a time-lapse, that's your cue to set up the shot. We just found our perfect time-lapse location. You'll be able to see that we have a really beautiful foreground, middle ground, and background, giving us a really nice dynamic shot, and it's going to make for a really wonderful time-lapse. Anybody can do this. It doesn't matter what kind of camera you're using. All you need to have is a tripod, a camera, and an intervalometer. So let's get set up. All right, so I'm using the Sony Alpha 1, and I'm pairing it with the 12-24 G Master. This is probably one of my favorite lenses because it's perfect for time-lapse. You get these really wide open vistas like we have out here, and this lens just captures all of that beautiful gloriousness. Now, I am also using an internal ND filter on the back of the lens here, and it's a 10-stop ND filter, so that's gonna allow us to drag the shutter or create longer shutter speeds out in the broad daylight like this. Dragging the shutter will also allow you to add motion blur to both people, cars, and wildlife during the daytime, which helps create a more cinematic feel. So I'm gonna go ahead and set it up. Then we're gonna go ahead and frame up, take my lens cap off. Pro tip, camera doesn't work without the lens cap off. So we're gonna go ahead and frame up our shot. So I'm gonna be setting this somewhere in the 21mm range. There. And I always make sure that I check focus in both areas. So I'll turn the autofocus on, I'll wait for my green box to come up here, and then that's going to allow me to know that that's in focus. But I'm also going to punch in the camera and just look around, and using the touch screen, I'm just going to go through here and see, yep, everything looks in focus. This is great. So I have my shutter speed set at half a second. I'm using f4.0 right now, and I'm set at ISO 100. This is gonna give me the cleanest image possible, and it's also gonna allow me to really bring out those shadows and midtones and highlights in post. I've also turned off anything auto. The lens is set to manual focus. There's no image stabilization turned on, and I've also got it set to daylight white balance. If you don't have an intervalometer, you can easily purchase one offline. There's plenty of external ones that you can add to whatever kind of camera you're using, but Sony does have an internal intervalometer, and it's probably one of my favorites to use because not only is it easy to set up on the camera, it allows you to have full playback in the play menu, which is really nice because after you're done shooting the time lapse, you can actually see what it looks like. For the final step of the process, we'll go ahead and set up our intervalometer. Hit Menu, Drive Mode, and near the end you'll see Interval Shoot function. This will bring up the interval menu. Turn the interval shooting to on, Select a start time, 1 to 2 seconds is usually recommended. Choose the interval. In this case, it's going to be 2 seconds because the clouds are moving pretty fast. And then we're going to change the number of shots to 500, which is going to give you about 20 seconds of beautiful time-lapse footage. So we've got our composition all set up, our intervalometer and intervals are set. All we have to do now is hit the shutter button and we're ready to rock and roll. When your time-lapse is finished, you can use the continuous playback functionality of the camera to watch the shot in real time on the back of the LCD screen. All right, so we got our time-lapse here. Now we're gonna go ahead and shoot for our Astro time-lapse tonight. Let's get set up for that. All right. Tonight, our composition is going to be this really beautiful barn in the background here. We do have some snow coming in here, so we may have some bad weather. But ultimately, what we're going to do is we're going to try to get a beautiful Astro time-lapse with the Milky Way gliding behind the backdrop here with the mountains as the background, and then the barn in the foreground. I'm going to be using the Sony a7R III for this with the 12-24 2.8. It's one of my favorite lens combinations for shooting Astro because it really gives you a wide range of versatility. You can go ultra wide or even a little bit tighter. One thing I like to do when I'm shooting Astro is I want to make sure that the focus is on point when I start shooting. So what I'll do is I'll actually jack the ISO all the way up. So on this camera, I'll take it all the way up to the maximum. And then what I can do is then zoom in. I have my C1 toggled in to zoom, and I can just go in there and check the focus. Now I've already pre-focused this, but you can just go back in and just to make sure that your shot is good. And then what we'll do next is we'll set up for the stars. Now when you choose your composition, think about where the stars are going to be going. You want to track the Milky Way. Is it going to fall from left to right? Is it going to rise above you? Those are all really important when you set up your composition. For me, what we're going to have happen here, because I know the layout and I know how the stars are going to roll, the Milky Way is actually going to glide right behind this barn, and it's going to look absolutely beautiful. So with that in mind, I'm going to go pretty wide. I'm using the 12mm here from the 12-24. And then what I would do is I would just comp the barn at the very bottom of the frame. That way I have more, at least 2/3 of the frame filled with stars, or if there's any atmospheric clouds, you might get the moon to reflect light on those, and I'll be going for that as well. When you're setting up for your interval, you want to make sure you keep them as close together as possible. So if your shutter speed is 10 seconds, you want to make that interval 11 seconds. That's going to give it a 1 second spacer from shot to shot and make it as fluid as possible when you are bringing it into post. And it's just going to make for a much better Astro shot, and it's going to look much more fluid and ultimately much more professional. What happens if you actually have a longer interval between is you'll see the stars jump or the clouds jump, and you really don't want that. You want to make sure that they're as close together as possible because that's going to yield the best shot when you go back into production. I'm going to be running a shutter speed of 10 seconds with a aperture of f2.8 and then an ISO of 1600, and that should allow me to see everything in beautiful detail with the sky as well as the foreground of the barn, because the moon is illuminating some of that foreground, which gives us a nice little fill light, and it's very helpful. But other than that, once you've set your interval, you can go ahead and start shooting. All right, so we just got done capturing all of that beautiful imagery, and now what we're gonna do is we're gonna process it. And I'm just using my laptop to do this. You can use your desktop or anything that has enough power to process, 5, 8, or even 10K resolution imagery. We are using the Sony Alpha 1, which is about a 10K resolution camera. I would recommend that you are using a computer that can handle that. But at the same time, if you're using something that's a little bit lighter weight in resolution, you shouldn't have any problem processing this. We're going to be using 2 programs today. One is DaVinci Resolve, and the other one is Adobe DNG Converter. And that's all you're going to need to create a beautiful cinematic time-lapse. The first thing we'll do is convert all of our raw Sony files into cinema DNG files through Adobe DNG Converter. This usually only takes a few seconds or minutes to do. When that's completed, we'll then go ahead and open up DaVinci Resolve and get started. First, we'll import our DNG sequence onto the timeline. This is going to allow us to play it back in its entirety, almost instantly actually, and then we'll adjust the scaling so the image fills the entire screen. Once that's been completed, we can go into the color properties tab and make all the color adjustments here, almost what you would do inside of Lightroom or Capture One. When you're happy with the color, you can play back your final scene to see exactly what you captured. That's it, guys. You just created your first time lapse. Very easy, super simple to do. In our next episode, I'm going to go through and talk about motion controlled time lapse as well as motion controlled video, and it just adds and amplifies what you can do in the time lapse world. But that's for another adventure. Thanks for joining us.